If you woke up in the Viking Age tonight, the first thing you would feel is the cold, and the second thing you would hear is the sea. It is always there, the sea. Even when you cannot see it, you can hear it, somewhere beyond the dark, the long, slow breathing of the water against the rocks of the fjord, the sound that every person in this world is born into and dies beside, the sound that is the beginning and the end of everything here. The land is hard, the winters are long, the growing season is short and uncertain, and the soil gives grudgingly, and there is never quite enough of it to go around. And so the people of this cold northern edge of the world have turned again and again toward the water, because the water is the only road that leads anywhere, and the only road that leads to more. You are in a longhouse. You do not yet know that this is what it is called, but you can feel its shape around you in the dark, long, and low. A single great room with a fire burning down its center, the smoke rising to a hole in the roof, the walls of timber and turf thick against the wind. The whole household sleeps here together along the raised platforms that run down both sides of the hall. The family, the workers, the animals at the far end behind a partition, their warmth a part of the warmth that keeps everyone alive through the night. You can smell them. You can smell the smoke and the bodies and the animals and the fish and the tar, and beneath it all, always, the salt of the sea. This is the world that history would come to call the Viking Age. The people who live in it do not call themselves Vikings. To go Viking is a thing you do, a voyage, a raid, not a thing you are. Most of them are farmers, others are fishermen, traders, and craftsmen. They are people of the long dark north, scratching a living from a hard land, bound by family and honor and the unforgiving law of a world with no king to enforce it and no mercy to spare. And some of them, in the season when the ice has gone and the water opens, will climb into long ships and row out past the mouth of the fjord toward horizons that no one in their world has yet mapped. And they will come back with silver, or with slaves, or with nothing, or they will not come back at all. Tonight, you are one of them. Not a warrior, not yet. Just a person, waking in the dark of a longhouse in a small settlement on the edge of a cold sea, at the beginning of an ordinary day, in a world that asks everything of the people who live in it. You do not speak their language. You do not know their gods, or their laws, or the thousand small things that everyone here learned before they could walk. You would not last a day, but the day has come anyway. The fire is low, the sea is breathing beyond the dark. Settle in, close your eyes. The Viking Age has already begun. The cold wakes you before the light does. It is in the air of the longhouse, a damp and bone-deep cold that the fire holds back only in a narrow circle down the center of the hall. And you are not in that circle. You are on one of the raised wooden platforms that line the walls, the set benches. They are wide enough to sit on by day and sleep on by night. Wool and furs wrap around you. They smell of smoke and of the animals they came from. You are pressed close to the warm shapes of other sleeping bodies because warmth here is shared, or it is lost. You lie still for a moment in the dark and listen. The longhouse speaks to you in the language of the night. You hear the settling of the fire, the breathing of a dozen sleepers, and the shift and stamp of the animals behind their partition. You hear the endless low voice of the wind working at the turf roof, and beneath all of it, far off, you hear the sea. You sit up, and the air at the level of your head is thick with the smoke that never fully leaves this place. There is no chimney, there is a hole in the roof, the smoke hole, through which the smoke is meant to escape, and through which the rain comes in. And the air near the floor is breathable, while the air above is a slow blue haze that has blackened the underside of the roof and the rafters and everything that hangs from them. The walls are timber where timber can be had, and turf where it cannot. Thick walls of cut earth packed against a wooden frame, and they are the reason this house is warm at all, the great mass of the earth itself holding back the worst of the northern winter. The Longhouse is the whole world in miniature, the people at the warm end near the fire, the animals at the cold end, everyone under one long roof, everyone breathing the same smoke, everyone surviving together or not at all. The fire is the heart of it. It runs down the center of the hall in a long hearth, and it is never allowed to go fully out. Because to rekindle a fire from nothing in this cold and damp is a labor, and a fire kept burning through the night is a fire that does not have to be made again at dawn. Someone, usually a woman of the household, for the keeping of the house is women's work, and the fire is the center of the house, banks the embers at night and wakes them in the morning, feeds them, coaxes them back into flame. And the first task of the Viking day is this, the waking of the fire, the small daily miracle on which everything else depends. You rise, and you are already dressed, because no one undresses to sleep in a cold like this. You wear a tunic of wool and trousers, and over them a heavier cloak, and on your feet shoes of leather, soft and thin and already damp. The wool is the gift of the sheep and the labor of the women, every thread of it spun by hand, every garment woven on the great upright looms that stand against the walls of every longhouse, the weaving that never stops, the work of clothing a household being as endless and as essential as the work of feeding it. Your clothes are dyed in the colors the land can give, the browns and the grays of undyed wool, and if you are fortunate, the deeper colors that the dye plants yield, the woad blue and the madder red that mark a person of some standing. A brooch holds your cloak at the shoulder. A belt holds a knife at your waist, because everyone here carries a knife, the knife being tool and weapon and the single most useful object a person can own. You step toward the door, past the sleeping shapes, past the fire, and the household is beginning to stir around you, the low voices, the cough, the cry of a child, the sounds of a great many people waking in a single room. At the door you pause, because the door of the Longhouse is the boundary between the warm, dark world of the house and the cold, gray world outside. And to cross it is to leave one and enter the other. And on a winter morning, the crossing takes a moment of resolve. Then you open it, and the cold comes in like water, and the world is there. It is a small world, and a vast one. The settlement is a scatter of buildings around the Longhouse, the byre for the animals that are not kept inside, the storehouses raised on posts to keep the rats and the damp from the precious grain, the smithy with its banked forge, the pit houses dug half into the ground where the weaving and the other crafts are done. Beyond the buildings are the home fields, the small hard-won patches of cultivated land where the barley and the oats are grown, fenced against the animals, fertilized with everything the household can spare, coaxed through the short growing season toward a harvest that is never certain. And beyond the fields the land rises into rough pasture, and then into the mountains, or falls away toward the water, depending on where in this northern world you happen to have woken. For the Viking lands stretch from the deep fjords of Norway to the flat farmlands of Denmark to the volcanic emptiness of newly settled Iceland, and each is hard in its own way. And there always is the fjord. The water lies still and dark and cold in the gray morning light, reaching inland between the mountains, and at its edge, drawn up on the shore or floating at a small wooden jetty, are the boats. Every settlement has boats. The boat is, to the Viking world, what the cart is to the farming worlds of the south, the means of moving, of trading, of fishing, of escaping, of raiding, the thing that connects this isolated settlement to all the other isolated settlements scattered along the endless coast. The water is the road, the boats are how you travel it. And the greatest of the boats, the long ships, the ones built for the open sea and the far voyage, are objects of such beauty and such value that they are the treasures of the whole community, named, loved, and in the end buried with the great dead as the highest honor the living can give. The settlement is not large, a single farm perhaps, or a handful of them clustered together. For this is not a world of villages and towns, but of scattered farmsteads, each its own small world, separated from its neighbors by miles of hard country or stretches of cold water. A wealthy farm is a cluster of buildings around the great longhouse. A poor one is little more than the longhouse itself and a byre. And the standing of the family is written in the buildings, the size of the hall, the number of the outbuildings, the quality of the carved doorposts, the wealth of animals in the byre. To be a free landholder, a man with his own farm, his own hall, his own animals and thralls, is to be a person of consequence in this world. A bondy, a free farmer, the backbone of the whole society, the man who holds land and bears arms and speaks at the thing. Below him are the free poor, the men without land of their own who work for others, and below them the thralls, the unfree. Above him are the great men, the chieftains and the lords whose halls are larger and whose followers are many. But the free farmer on his own land is the heart of it, neither rich nor enslaved, holding his small, hard-won place in the world by his own labor and his own strength and his own honor. And the land itself shapes the life upon it more here than almost anywhere. Where you have woken determines what your days will be. In the deep fjords of Norway, the farms cling to the narrow strips of flat land between the mountains and the water, the sea the only easy road, the boats more important than any cart, the mountains rising sheer, and the winters dark and long. In the flatter, kinder lands of Denmark, the farming is richer and the fields wider, and the people more numerous. The great trading towns growing on the trade routes between the north and the rest of Europe. In the broad forests and lakes of Sweden, the eastward trade beckons, the rivers leading away toward Russia and the distant east. And in the new lands the Norse have settled, the wind-scoured emptiness of Iceland, the harsh green margins of Greenland. The settlers carve out a new life on the very edge of the habitable world, in places no one had lived before they came. The Viking world is not one place but many, a scattering of peoples along thousands of miles of cold coast, united by a language and a religion and a way of the sea, divided by the hard particular country each of them must wrest a living from. You breathe the cold air, and it is clean and sharp and smells of salt and of wood smoke, and of the sea, and the day is beginning, and there is, as there always is here, a very great deal of work to do. You are hungry, and in the Viking world, hunger is not an occasional thing but a season, a long stretch of every year when the food runs low and the body learns to wait. The morning meal, the dagmail, comes a few hours after waking, after the first work of the day is done, and it is the more substantial of the two meals the Viking day provides. There is bread, flat, dense, baked on a stone or a griddle over the fire, made from barley or oats or rye, the grain ground at home on a hand quern, that two-stoned mill that every household owns, and that the women turn by hand for hours to make the day's flour. The bread is heavy and coarse and gritty with the stone dust of the quern, and like the bread of every pre-modern world, it slowly wears the teeth flat over a lifetime. But it is the foundation, the thing that fills the belly when there is little else. With the bread, there is whatever the household has. There is skyr, the thick soured milk that is one of the great staples of the north, made from the milk of the cows and the sheep and the goats, kept and fermented and eaten through the year. There is cheese and butter, both of them ways of preserving the brief abundance of milk from the summer, grazing into the lean months of the winter. There is fish, above all fish, for the sea is the great larder of this world, and the people of the coast eat fish in quantities that would astonish you, fresh when it can be caught. But more often dried, the cod and the herring split and hung on great wooden racks in the cold dry wind until they are hard as wood, stockfish that will keep for years, and that can be carried on voyages and traded across the whole northern world. You soak the dried fish, or you simply beat it and chew it, and it is salt and tough and endlessly familiar, the taste of survival. There is meat, but meat is precious. The animals are too valuable alive to be killed lightly. The cow for her milk, the sheep for her wool, the ox for his labor, and so meat comes mostly in the autumn, at the great slaughter. When the animals that cannot be fed through the winter are killed and their flesh preserved, smoked and salted and dried, to last the cold months. Pork is prized, the pig, kept only for its meat, is the animal you eat. And on the great occasions, the feasts and the sacrifices, there is the meat of the animals offered to the gods, boiled in great iron cauldrons and shared among the whole community. The rare abundance that binds the people together and reminds them in the depth of the dark year that they are not alone. You do not drink water if you can help it, the same as in every old world, the water is not trusted, and there is better to be had. What you drink, day in and day out, is ale. The ale of the Viking world is brewed in every household, from barley, weak and nourishing and safe, and it is drunk by everyone, at every meal, the way the South drinks wine and the farming worlds drink their small beer. The brewing is women's work, like so much of what keeps the household alive, and a woman who brews well is valued for it. And then there is mead. It is the drink of the feast and the drink of the gods. It is fermented from honey, stronger and sweeter and rarer than ale. It flows at the great gatherings and fills the poetry of this world. Mead is also the substance of the famous hall of Valhalla, where the chosen dead drink it forever. To drink together is one of the deepest acts of the Viking world. The hall, the ale, the shared cup, the bonds of loyalty sealed in drink. These are the heart of how this society holds itself together, lord and follower bound by the giving and the sharing of the feast. But there is one place and one time where the hunger is forgotten, where the plainness gives way to abundance, and that is the feast in the hall. And to understand the Viking world, you must understand what the feast meant to it. The hall is the center of everything for the great and the powerful, not the ordinary longhouse of the farmer, but the great hall of the chieftain or the king, the long, high building where the Lord gathers his followers and feeds them and binds them to himself. For the bond between a lord and his men is sealed in the hall, over the feast, in the giving and the sharing of food and drink and treasure. A lord must be generous, a lord who feeds his men well, who fills their cups, who gives them gifts of silver and of arm rings and of fine weapons, is a lord who is followed, whose hall is full, whose name is sung. The ring-giver, the poets call a good lord, the generous one, the breaker of rings who shares out his wealth among his followers, and generosity is the highest virtue of the great. For a hoard of silver locked away is worthless, while silver given to your men in the hall buys their loyalty and their love and their willingness to die for you. The miser is despised, the generous lord is glorified, and the whole bond that holds the warband and the kingdom together runs through the giving of the feast. And so the feast is a thing of splendor in a world of scarcity. The great cauldrons of meat boiled over the fires, the roasted pork and the beef of the sacrifice, the bread and the cheese, and the butter brought out in abundance, the ale flowing, and the mead. Above all the mead, the honey drink of the gods, passed in the great horn around the company. The Lord sits in the high seat at the center of the hall, his most honored men beside him. The others ranged down the benches by their standing, and the woman of the household. For even here it is the woman who bears the cup, carries the drink to the men in their order, the offering of the cup a thing of ceremony and of honor. There is the poet singing the praises of the Lord and the deeds of the company. There is the boasting, the vows made over the cup, and the great oaths that bind a man to a deed. There is laughter, quarrel, and contest of wit. And around it all is the deep, warm fellowship of the hall, held against the cold and the dark outside. The feast is the Viking world at its best and most joyful. It is abundance answering scarcity. It is fellowship answering isolation. It is warmth, light, and fullness answering the long, dark winter. It is the place where loyalty, love, and obligation are made and remade in the sharing of the cup. And it is no accident that the Viking imagination placed its paradise in exactly such a hall. Valhalla, the reward of the brave dead, is a feast that never ends, the warriors fighting all day and feasting all night, the mead flowing without limit, the boar that is eaten each evening and whole again each morning, the eternal hall of the eternal feast. The thing the Viking longed for, the thing his religion promised the worthy, was the thing he knew at its best in life, the warm hall, the endless mead, the fellowship of brave companions, the feast against the dark. To a people who knew real hunger, who counted the stores against the winter, and lost the week to the lean months of the spring, the dream of a hall where the food and the drink never ran out was a dream of heaven itself. The food is plain, and it is hard won, and there is, in most years, just barely enough. The Viking diet is healthier than you might expect. The fish and the dairy and the grain give a reasonable balance, and the people are, by the standards of their age, tall and strong and well-formed. But it is monotonous beyond imagining. the same dried fish and coarse bread and soured milk through the endless dark of the winter, and it is always shadowed by the fear of the year when there will not be enough. For the great enemy here is not war most of the time, and not even disease. It is hunger. The growing season is brutally short. A single bad summer, too wet, too cold, the barley rotting in the field, and the winter that follows is a winter of starvation, the stores eaten through before the spring, the weak dying first, and then the strong. This is the engine that drives so much of the Viking story. The hard land that cannot feed its people, the younger sons with no farm to inherit, the constant pressure to find more land, more food, more silver, somewhere out beyond the mouth of the fjord. And so even the morning meal carries the weight of it. You eat what there is. You do not waste. You measure the stores in your mind against the length of the winter still to come, the way every person in this world measures them, constantly, instinctively, because the difference between enough and not enough is the difference between life and death. And the margin is thin, and the sea road and the raid and the long voyage south are, in the end, ways of widening that margin, of taking from the soft, rich lands of the world what the hard land of the north will not give. You finish the bread and the dried fish and the soured milk, and the day's work is waiting, and the sea is bright and cold beyond the fields. The work of the Viking farm never ends, and it falls on every back, free and unfree alike, because there is no other way for the household to survive. This is, before it is anything else, a world of farmers. The image of the Viking is the warrior in the long ship, and that image is real, but it is the exception, the brief season, the dream of glory and silver that hangs over a life that is otherwise spent almost entirely in the patient, brutal labor of wresting a living from a cold and stony land. Most Vikings never raided. Most lived and died within sight of the farm where they were born, and the work of that farm, the animals, the fields, the hay, the endless making and mending, was the substance of their lives. The animals come first, always, because the animals are the wealth. A man's standing is measured in his livestock, the cattle above all, the cows whose milk feeds the household, and whose number is the visible sign of a family's prosperity, the sheep whose wool clothes everyone, the goats, the pigs, the horses, the oxen that pull the plow, and the sledge. They must be fed, watered, milked, watched, moved between pastures, protected from the cold and the predators and the thief. In the brief northern summer they are driven up to the high mountain pastures, the sheilings. There the grass grows lush. The young people of the household live for the season in rough huts, tending the herds and making cheese and butter for the winter. It is a season of relative freedom and isolation, high in the green mountains under the endless summer light. And then in the autumn they are brought down again, and the terrible reckoning begins. How many can be fed through the winter on the hay that has been cut, and how many must be killed? For the hay is everything. This is the secret labor at the heart of the Viking farm. The work that the sagas do not sing of, but that the survival of every household depends on. The animals cannot graze through the northern winter. The grass is gone, the land is frozen or buried in snow, and so they must be fed, for months on hay, on dried grass cut and gathered in the short summer and stored against the long winter. And so the whole community throws itself, in the brief weeks of summer when the grass is ready, into the cutting of the hay, the men and the women and the children and the thralls, all in the meadows, with their scythes and their rakes, racing the weather. Because hay that is rained on rots, and hay that rots is animals that starve, and animals that starve is a household that does not survive the year. The amount of hay you can cut and store sets the limit on the number of animals you can keep, and the number of animals sets the wealth and the survival of the household, and so the haymaking is, in its quiet way, the most important work of the Viking year. The fields are smaller and harder than the meadows. The grain, the barley, the oats, the rye, is grown in small plots near the house, the soil thin and stony and grudging, the season so short that the crop is always a gamble. You plow with an ard, a simple scratch plow drawn by oxen that breaks the soil without turning it, and you sow by hand. And you weed, and you watch, and you pray to whatever gods you trust, that the summer will be warm enough and dry enough to bring the grain to harvest before the autumn closes in. In a good year, the harvest fills the storehouses, and the winter is secure. In a bad year, and the bad years come, the years when the summer is cold and wet, and the grain never ripens, the harvest fails, and the long dark hunger begins, and there is nothing to be done but eat through the stores and hope to reach the spring. And then there is the rest of it, the endless making and mending that fills every hour the animals and the fields do not. There is the wood to be cut and split and stacked for the fire and for building. There is the iron to be worked at the forge, for every farm of any size has its smith, and the iron tools, the scythe, the axe, the knife, the nails, must be made and sharpened and repaired. There is the wool to be spun and woven, the great upright loom never idle, the women's hands never still. There is the leather to be worked, the rope to be twisted, the nets to be mended, the boats to be tarred and repaired. There is the milking and the churning and the brewing and the grinding of the grain. The Viking household is a workshop and a farm and a factory all at once, producing almost everything it consumes, and the work of producing it is the texture of every waking hour. And much of this work, the hardest and the lowest of it, is done by people who are not free. For the Viking world runs on slavery, on the thralls, the unfree, the property of others, who do the labor that the free would rather not. Some are born to it, the children of thralls. Many are taken, captured in raids, bought in the great slave markets of the age, for the Vikings were among the foremost slave traders of their world. And the captives they took from the monasteries and villages of the lands they raided were as much the object of the raid as the silver. The thrall has no rights that matter, no honor, no standing. The thrall can be bought and sold and worked and beaten, and in the darkest moments of this world, killed, sacrificed at the funeral of a great person to accompany them into death. And yet the thrall is also a person who works alongside the free in the same fields, under the same roof. And a thrall can sometimes win or buy or be granted freedom. And the line between the unfree and the free poor is not always as wide as the law pretends. It is a brutal institution, woven into the fabric of everything, the dark foundation beneath the whole structure of the Viking farm, the unfree hands that cut the hay and tend the animals and turn the quern. So that the household may survive, and the free may, in the season of the open water, dream of silver and of glory out beyond the sea. The keys at her belt are the sign of her power, and in the Viking world, The woman who holds the keys holds more than you might think. You will have grown up in your own world with a particular picture of the Viking, and it is a picture of men. The warriors, the raiders, the kings. But the world you have woken into could not function for a single day without its women, and the women of this world hold a place that is, by the standards of their age, remarkable, not equal, not free of the hard limits that every old world placed on women, but real and respected and backed by law in ways that the women of the lands to the south could only have envied. The household is hers. The longhouse, the stores, the dairy, the weaving, the brewing, the feeding and clothing of everyone under the roof. All of this is the woman's domain, ruled by the woman of the house, the husfreyja, and the keys at her belt are the literal and the symbolic sign of it. She holds the keys to the storehouses, to the chests where the valuables are kept, to the locked places where the household's wealth and food are secured. And to hold the keys is to hold authority, the management of the whole economic life of the farm. When her husband is away, and in this world the men are often away, at sea, at the Thing, on the long trading voyages that can last a year or more, on the raids from which they may not return, the woman does not become idle or dependent. She runs everything. She becomes, in his absence, the head of the household, in fact, if not in name, managing the farm, commanding the workers and the thralls, making the decisions, defending the family's interests. The Viking woman is, by necessity and by custom, a manager, an administrator, a person of consequence. And the law gives her rights that are striking for the age. She can own property in her own name. She can inherit, not equally with her brothers, but really a daughter taking a share of the family's wealth. She brings property into her marriage, the dowry, which remains hers, and she is entitled to a portion of the household's wealth, and if the marriage ends, she takes her property with her. And the marriage can end, for this is perhaps the most remarkable of the Viking woman's rights, at her own choice. A Viking woman can divorce her husband. The procedure is real and recognized. She declares her intention before witnesses. She states her grounds, and the marriage is dissolved, and she returns to her family or her own household with her property and her dignity intact. The grounds a woman might cite tell their own story of what this world expected of a marriage: a husband who struck her, a husband who failed to provide, a husband who shamed her, a husband who could not perform his part of the partnership. The marriage in the Viking world is, at its best, a partnership of two people running a household together, each with their domain, each with their dignity. And a partnership that fails can be ended by either party. There were lands far to the south where a woman would not win such a right for another 1,000 years. This is not to say the Viking woman was free or equal in any sense you would recognize. The world was ruled by men. The public power, the law, the assembly, the war, the kingship belonged to men, and a woman's standing came largely through the men she was connected to: her father, her husband, her sons. Marriages were arranged often as alliances between families, the woman's wishes one consideration among several. Violence against women was real, and the law's protection imperfect. And the unfree women, the thralls, had no rights at all, their bodies and their labor the property of others, subject to whatever their owners chose. The Viking woman's strength was real, but it was bounded, exercised within a world that men ultimately ruled. And yet within those bounds, the texture of her life was one of genuine authority and genuine respect. She managed the wealth. She made the cloth that was one of the great trade goods of the whole Viking world, the woven wool sails and garments that were as valuable in their way as the silver the men brought home. She kept the memory and the lore of the family, the genealogies, the stories, the knowledge of the herbs and the healing. And in the realm of the sacred, women held a power that men did not. The practice of Seiðr, the magic of prophecy and fate, was women's magic above all. And the Volva, the seeress, the woman who could see what was coming and speak with the spirits, was a figure of awe and fear, welcomed and feared in equal measure, a woman whose word could shape the decisions of kings. There were warrior women too, or the stories of them, the shield maidens of the sagas, the women who took up arms, and the archaeology has begun to suggest that these were not pure legend, that some women were buried with weapons and the honors of warriors. How common they truly were, no one can say. But the fact that the Viking imagination could hold the figure of the woman warrior at all says something important. It could tell stories of her and honor her. Her place was harder, more dangerous, and more constrained than any modern woman would accept. Yet for its time, it was freer, stronger, and more respected than almost anywhere else in the world. The woman with the keys at her belt was no one's mere possession. She was the keeper of the household, the holder of its wealth, the manager of its life, and in a hard world that asked everything of everyone, she gave as much as any. Your honor is the most valuable thing you own, and in a world with no king and no police, it is also the only thing protecting your life. This is the hardest thing for a modern mind to grasp about the Viking world, harder than the cold or the hunger or the violence. That it is a society almost without a state. There is no king who rules over most of it, not for most of the age. There are local lords, chieftains, big men whose power rests on their wealth and their followers. But there is no central authority, no government, no police, no system of courts with the power to compel and to punish. And into the vast space where the state would be, the Viking world puts two things: the law, which is a matter of the community as a whole, and honor, which is a matter of every individual and every family. And of the two, in daily life, honor is the one you live and die by. Honor here is not an abstraction. It is the hard, practical currency of your standing in the community, your reputation, the regard in which others hold you, and in a world where there is no police to protect you and no state to enforce your rights, your reputation is your protection. A person known to be strong, to be honorable, to be backed by a powerful family, to be someone who will answer an insult and avenge a wrong, that person is safe, because to harm them is to invite retaliation. A person known to be weak, to be without honor, to be someone who will swallow an insult and let a wrong pass, that person is prey, because there is no cost to harming them. And so honor must be defended, constantly, fiercely, because to let it slip is to slip down toward the bottom of the world, toward the place where you can be robbed and beaten and killed with impunity, because everyone knows you will not or cannot strike back. This is why the Viking world is so touchy, so quick to take offense, so concerned with insult and slight and the precise calibration of respect. An insult is not a mere word. It is an attack on the thing that keeps you safe, and it must be answered, or your standing falls. The law itself recognizes this, and the worst insults, the nith, The deadly insults that question a man's courage or his manhood are crimes in themselves, because the world understands that such words can destroy a person as surely as a blow. To call a man a coward, to suggest he is unmanly, to mock him in verse, these are acts of war, and the man who suffers them must respond, or be diminished in the eyes of everyone. And when honor is wounded and cannot be repaired with words or with payment, there is the duel. The Holmgang, the island-going, for it was often fought on a small island or a marked-off square of ground, is the formal combat by which two men settle a matter of honor with weapons under rules before witnesses. The challenge is given and cannot be refused without disgrace. To refuse a Holmgang is to admit you are in the wrong or that you are a coward, either of which destroys you. The two men face each other on the marked ground with their weapons and their shields, and they fight by turns or freely depending on the local rules until one is wounded or yields or dies, or the matter is otherwise settled. The Holmgang is dangerous, and it is also, in its way, a kind of order, a channel for the violence of wounded honor, a way of settling a quarrel that might otherwise spread, contained within rules and witnesses rather than spilling into the dark of ambush and murder. But the rules do not always hold, and beneath the formal duel lies the deeper and more terrible institution of the Viking world, the feud. When a man is killed or grievously wronged, and the matter is not settled, his family is bound by honor to avenge him. The killing must be answered with a killing, or with a payment, the vergild, the man price, the compensation that the law sets for a death, the silver that can buy peace between two families and stop the cycle of vengeance before it begins. The whole machinery of Viking law is built around this: the calculation of what a death is worth, the negotiation of the payment, the attempt to channel the desire for vengeance into the exchange of silver rather than the exchange of blood. And sometimes it works, but sometimes the offense is too great, or the family's too proud, or the payment refused, and then the feud begins. And the killings answer the killings, back and forth, year after year, generation after generation, a slow bleeding that can consume whole families and whole districts, each death demanding the next, the honor of each side requiring that the score be evened, and then over-evened until everyone has lost more than the original quarrel was ever worth. The sagas are full of these feuds, and they are not entertainment. They are the memory of a real and terrible feature of this world, the dark underside of a society that placed honor above almost everything and had no king to make it stop. To live here is to walk always with this awareness, that your safety rests on your reputation, that your reputation must be defended, that an insult swallowed is a step toward ruin, and a wrong unavenged is a debt that will be remembered. It is exhausting and it is dangerous, and it produces a society of people who are proud and prickly and quick to violence and deeply, fiercely concerned with how they are seen. But it is also, in its way, a kind of freedom, a world without masters, where every free person stands on their own honor and their own strength and their own family, beholden to no king, answerable to no state, defending their own name in a world that respects nothing else as much. When the free men gather at the Thing, the Viking world comes as close as it ever comes to having a government, and it is a strange and powerful thing to see. For all that this is a world without a state, it is not a world without law. The Vikings were a deeply law-minded people, and their law was one of the things they were proudest of, one of the things that distinguished the free man from the slave and the civilized community from the chaos of the wild. But the law was not handed down by a king or enforced by his officers. The law belonged to the people, to the community of free men, and it was made and remembered and applied at the assembly, the Thing. The Thing is a gathering of the free men of a district, held at a fixed place and a fixed season, where the business of the community is done. Here disputes are brought and judged. Here the law is recited and applied. Here marriages and land deals and the great affairs of the district are witnessed and made binding. Here a man can seek justice against another, bringing his case before the assembled community. And here the community decides. It is part court, part parliament, part fair, part festival, for people come from far around. And the Thing is also a great social occasion, a chance to trade, to meet, to arrange marriages, to hear the news, to drink and to feast on the edges of the serious business. In a scattered world of isolated farms, the Thing is the great coming together, the moment when the community remembers that it is a community. And the heart of it, in many places, is a figure of extraordinary importance, the law speaker. For the law is not written, it lives in memory, in the trained mind of the law speaker, a man who has learned the entire law of the district by heart, and who recites it at the Thing, a portion each year, so that the community may hear it and remember it and be bound by it. To hold the whole law of a people in your memory, to be the living book of the law, is a position of immense respect, and the law speaker's recitation, standing on the law rock before the assembled free men, is one of the central rituals of the Viking world. The law is the people's, but the law speaker is its keeper, and his word on what the law is carries enormous weight. The justice of the Thing is the justice of a community without a police force, and it works in ways that would seem strange to you. There is no state to arrest a wrongdoer, no prison to hold him, no officer to carry out a sentence. The Thing can judge, but it cannot, by itself, enforce. And so its punishments are of a particular kind. There are fines, the payment of compensation, the weregild for a death, the silver that buys peace. And there is the most terrible sentence the Thing can pass, the sentence that is worse than death: outlawry. To be made an outlaw is to be cast out of the protection of the law entirely. The full outlaw is no longer a person in the eyes of the community. He can be killed by anyone, with no penalty, for he is outside the law that would punish his killing. No one may help him, feed him, shelter him. To do so is to share his crime. He must flee into the wilderness, into the mountains, across the sea, away from every settlement and every human face, for to remain is to die. Outlawry is exile and death sentence in one, the community's ultimate weapon against the one who has broken its bonds too gravely to be allowed to remain. And it is feared above almost anything, for to be cut off from the community in a world this hard is to be cut off from life itself. Some outlaws survived in the wild, alone or in bands of other outcasts, and the sagas tell their stories with a kind of awe, but most did not, and the threat of it hung over every man as the final consequence of placing himself beyond the law. The Thing reaches its greatest expression in Iceland, in the Althing, the assembly of the whole island, gathered each summer at the great plain of Thingvellir, where the free men of all Iceland came together to make and apply the law of a whole society that had no king at all. For Iceland in the Viking Age was something the world had rarely seen, a functioning society, a whole country, governed entirely by law and assembly, by the gathering of its free men and the memory of its law speakers, with no king, no central government, no state in the ordinary sense. It was not a peaceful place or an equal one. The feuds raged, the powerful dominated the weak, the thralls had nothing. But it was a society that held itself together for centuries on the strength of law and honor and assembly alone, an experiment in self-government at the cold edge of the world, and the thing was its beating heart. To stand at the thing, then, is to stand at the one place where the scattered, proud, violent, law-minded people of the Viking world become, for a season, a single body, gathered to remember their law, to judge their disputes, to bind their bargains, to cast out their outlaws, and to feel in the gathering itself the thing that the isolation of the farms and the long dark of the winters is always threatening to dissolve, that they belong to one another, that they are a people, that there is a law above the strength of any single man, and that it is theirs. The gods are everywhere, and they are not distant or merciful, and the relationship with them is less worship than it is a hard bargain struck between equals who do not entirely trust each other. You have come into a world before the cross, or at least before the cross has finished its long conquest of the north, a world of older gods, the gods of the Norse, whose names the days of your own week still carry. Odin and Thor, Freyr and Freya, Tyr and Loki, and the whole vast company of the Aesir and the Vanir, the gods of war and wisdom and fertility, and the storm and the sea and the harvest and the dead. They are not the loving Father God of the South. They are powerful, dangerous, capricious beings, more like the forces of the harsh world itself than like a benevolent creator, gods you must deal with, must placate, must bargain with, must keep on your side. Because their favor can mean the difference between the good harvest and the failed one, the safe voyage and the wreck, the victory and the slaughter. Odin is the highest of them and the strangest. He is the god of war, wisdom, poetry, and the dead. He is the one-eyed wanderer who gave his eye for knowledge and hung himself on the world tree for 9 nights to win the secret of the runes. He is a god of fury and cunning, a god who is not to be trusted. He gives victory and then takes it away. He gathers the bravest of the slain to his hall, not out of love, but because he needs them for the final battle that is coming. Thor is more beloved by the ordinary person. He is the god of thunder, strength, and protection. He guards gods and men against the giants and the monsters of the wild. He is the red-bearded defender with the great hammer. The farmer prays to him for rain, and the warrior prays to him for strength. Across the Viking world, people wear his hammer as an amulet around their necks. And there are the others. Freyr and Freya, the divine brother and sister of the Vanir, are gods of fertility, love, harvest, and wealth. Tyr is the war god who gave his hand. Loki is the trickster, both friend and enemy of the gods. One day, his mischief will help bring about their doom. To understand the shape of this world, you must know its great map, the 9 worlds held in the branches and the roots of the world tree, the vast ash Yggdrasil whose limbs hold up the heavens and whose roots reach down into the depths, the tree that is the frame and the structure of all existence. At the center is Midgard, the middle world, the world of men, the world you have woken into, ringed by the great ocean and the serpent that coils within it. Above is Asgard, the world of the gods, joined to Midgard by the rainbow bridge Bifrost, that the gods alone may cross. There is Jotunheim, the world of the giants, the ancient enemies of the gods, the forces of chaos, and the wild that the gods must forever hold back. There is Vanaheim of the older gods, and Alfheim of the light elves, and Svartalfheim of the dark elves, and the dwarves who are the great smiths of the cosmos, the makers of the gods' treasures. And below all is Niflheim, the world of ice and mist, and Hell, the cold realm of the dead who did not die in battle. The whole of it is bound together by the world tree. An eagle watches from its branches, a dragon gnaws at its root, a squirrel runs up and down the trunk, carrying insults between them. It is a cosmos vast, strange, and alive, full of beings and forces. It is ordered, yet always under threat. Within that great structure, the small life of the farm and the fjord is lived. And the relationship between the worlds is one of perpetual struggle, the gods against the giants, order against chaos, the forces that build against the forces that tear down. The gods are not all-powerful. They are mighty but limited, clever but not wise enough, strong but not strong enough, forever contending against the giants and the monsters who would pull the whole structure down into ruin. Thor's hammer is the great weapon of this struggle, the thunder that beats back the giants, the protection of Midgard and Asgard both. And the farmer who prays to Thor and wears his hammer about his neck is asking for a share of that protection, that strength against the chaos that presses always at the edges of the ordered world. This is a religion not of a benevolent creator watching over his creation, but of embattled gods holding a line that is always being pushed back in a cosmos that is beautiful and dangerous and doomed. And over all of it hangs the great shadow of the Norse understanding of the world, the thing that makes this religion unlike almost any other, the certainty that it will all end. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the final battle in which the gods and the giants and the monsters will destroy one another, in which Odin will be devoured, and Thor will fall, and the sun will be swallowed, and the world will burn and sink into the sea. The gods themselves are doomed. They know it. They fight on anyway. This is the deep, tragic heart of the Norse religion, not a promise of salvation, not a benevolent order watching over creation, but a universe sliding toward an ending that even the gods cannot prevent, in which the only thing that matters in the end is how you meet your fate. Courage in the face of certain doom, that is the Norse virtue above all others, modeled by the gods themselves, who face their own destruction without flinching. The practice of the religion is not a matter of churches and priests and weekly worship. It is woven into the fabric of life, into the household and the season and the great occasions. There are sacred places, groves, springs, certain halls, certain stones, but no great temples in most of the Viking world, no separate caste of priests. The chieftain, the head of the household, the leader of the community, is also the leader of its religious life. The same man who rules the farm and represents it at the thing also leads its dealings with the gods. And the central act of those dealings is the blot, the sacrifice, the offering to the gods of what is precious, above all the offering of animals, slaughtered in the sacred place, their blood sprinkled on the altars, and the participants and the images of the gods, their meat then boiled and eaten in a great communal feast. For the blot is not a grim or fearful thing, it is a feast, a celebration, the community gathered to share the sacred meal, to drink the sacred ale, to bind themselves to the gods and to one another in the sharing of food and drink. The animal is given to the gods, and the gods give it back as the feast, and the eating of it is communion with the divine. The sacrifices follow the seasons, the great blot of the autumn at the slaughter, when the animals that cannot be kept through the winter are killed, and the killing is made sacred. The blot of midwinter in the depth of the dark, when the sun must be coaxed back, the blot of the spring for victory and for the success of the coming season's voyages. And at the greatest occasions, in the most desperate times, the sacrifice could be more than animals. The sources speak with horror and fascination of human sacrifice, of thralls and captives, and sometimes even of the willing, offered to the gods at the great communal blots, or sent to accompany the powerful dead. And the archaeology and the foreign accounts confirm that this was real, that the Viking world, in its extremity and its devotion, would on occasion give to the gods the highest price of all, a human life. It is a measure of how seriously this world took its bargain with the gods, and of how hard and unsentimental that world could be. Beneath the great gods and the public sacrifices lies a dense world of smaller sacred things. There are the spirits of the land, the elves, the dwarves, and the giants. There are the guardian spirits of the family and the farm. There are the dead in their mounds, the magic of the runes, the Seiðr, and the casting of lots. Life is a constant negotiation with an unseen world that is everywhere and must be kept in balance. To live here is to live in a world that is full of gods, spirits, fate, and the dead, full of forces that watch and judge and must be dealt with. Nothing is merely physical. Everything is charged with meaning, and everything slides toward the great ending that even the gods await with open eyes. The ship is the greatest thing this world has made, and to stand beside one drawn up on the shore is to understand all at once how a scatter of poor farmers on the cold edge of the world came to terrify and to transform half of it. You have seen the long ships in the harbor, but you have not truly looked at one until you stand beside it, and then it takes your breath. It is long and lean and impossibly graceful, the hull a single smooth curve from the high-carved prow to the high-carved stern, built of overlapping planks of oak riveted together, the clinker construction that is the secret of its strength and its flexibility, the hull that flexes and gives with the sea rather than fighting it. It is light enough to be dragged up onto a beach or carried across a stretch of land between two rivers, and strong enough to cross the open ocean. It draws so little water that it can sail up a shallow river deep into a country, far beyond where any deep-keeled ship could follow, and run right up onto a beach to disgorge its crew. It is rowed by the crew at their oars along both sides, and it is sailed with a single great square sail of woven wool that can drive it across the sea before the wind. And it is faster than anything else on the water in its world, and it is seaworthy in conditions that would sink the ships of any other people of its age. The long ship is 1,000 years of accumulated craft, the perfected tool of a people who lived by the water, and it is the single most important object in the entire Viking story, because without it, there would be no Viking story at all. To build one is the work of a community and a master. The shipwright is among the most honored of craftsmen. His skill, the difference between a ship that crosses the ocean and a ship that founders. The great oak trees are felled and split, not sawn, but split along the grain, so that each plank follows the natural strength of the wood. The keel is laid, the long backbone of the ship, and the planks are built up from it, each overlapping the one below, riveted with iron, the gaps caulked with tarred wool to keep out the sea. The frame is fitted inside the shell of the planks. The mast is stepped, the rigging rove, the sail, itself the product of years of women's weaving, a sail being as costly and as laborious to make as the hull, bent on. And the whole is finished with the carving and the painting that make the long ship not just a tool, but a treasure. The fierce carved beast heads at the prow, the shields ranged along the sides, the object of pride and beauty that the whole community has made together. A great ship is named and loved, and a man's ship can be the most valuable thing he owns. And the highest honor the Viking world can give, its greatest dead, is to bury them in their ship, the whole vessel dragged ashore and laid in the earth with the body and the treasures and sometimes the sacrificed servants to carry the dead into whatever comes next. And to sail one across the open sea, out of sight of land, is a feat that should not have been possible. And the Vikings did it routinely. They had no compass. They had no charts as you would know them. They navigated by the accumulated lore of generations. They used the sun and the stars, the direction of the wind and the feel of the waves. They watched the color of the water, the kinds of birds and fish, and the sight of distant mountains. They knew the loom of land below the horizon. Above all, they carried a deep practical knowledge of the sea, held in the minds of experienced steersmen and passed down by word and by doing. They knew the sailing directions to the places they went, so many days west from this headland, keeping the pole star at such a height until the mountains of Iceland rise from the sea. They read the ocean the way you read a road. And on the strength of that knowledge and those ships, they went everywhere, west to the Faroes, to Iceland, to Greenland, and finally, 5 centuries before Columbus, to the shores of North America itself, the first Europeans to cross the whole Atlantic and set foot on a new world. East and south down the great rivers of Russia, all the way to Constantinople and the Caspian, trading and raiding and serving as the bodyguards of emperors. South to the British Isles, to Ireland, to France, to Spain, into the Mediterranean. The long ship took them, and the world had nothing that could catch them or stop them. And for 2.5 centuries they ranged across a quarter of the globe, a few thousand people from a few poor lands in the north, carried by the most beautiful and the most deadly machine of their age. To go to sea in one, though, is to gamble with your life. The open ocean of the north is no gentle water. It is cold and violent and vast, and the long ship, for all its seaworthiness, is an open boat, with no deck, no shelter, the crew exposed to the full fury of the weather for the whole of the voyage. The men row and bail and steer and endure, soaked and frozen and exhausted, for days, for weeks, sleeping where they can in the open boat, eating the dried fish and the hard bread they have carried, drinking the ale until it runs out, and then the water. A storm can scatter a fleet or swallow a ship whole, and many ships that sailed out of the fjords were never seen again, lost with all their crews somewhere in the gray immensity of the sea. The voyage to Iceland, to Greenland, across the Atlantic, these were undertaken in the knowledge that a good portion of those who set out would not arrive. And they set out anyway, generation after generation, because the ship made it possible, and the hard land at home made it necessary, and the silver and the land and the glory out beyond the horizon made it worth the gamble. And there was not one ship but many kinds, each shaped for its purpose, for the Norse were the masters of the boat in all its forms. There was the long ship proper, the warship, the dragon ship, long and low and narrow and fast, built to carry a crew of fighting men swiftly across the sea and up onto a beach, the famous ship of the raids, the predator of the coasts. But there was also the Nar, the broad, deep-bellied cargo ship. It was shorter, wider, and higher-sided than the longship. It was built not for speed or war, but to carry. It carried furs, silver, slaves, settlers, and whole families across the open ocean. It was the workhorse of Viking trade and the ship that carried colonists to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. The Nar relied more on its sail and less on its oars, riding higher and deeper in the water, slower but steadier, able to carry tons of cargo and whole families with their animals across the gray immensity of the Atlantic. And there were the smaller boats beyond counting, the fishing boats, the ferries, the little craft that every farm kept for the daily business of a life lived beside the water. The Viking was a person of the boat in the way that other peoples were people of the horse, the whole of life shaped around the vessel and the water it crossed, the child learning the feel of the sea before it could well walk. And the building and the keeping of these ships was the great craft of the whole society, the skill in which the Norse surpassed every other people of their age. The tools were simple, the axe above all, for the Viking shipwright shaped his planks with the axe rather than the saw, splitting and hewing the oak along its grain, so that every plank kept the natural strength of the living wood. The knowledge was deep and unwritten, held in the hands and the eyes of the master shipwrights. The sense of the curve and the line that made a hull that was both strong and supple, that flexed with the sea and did not break, that sat in the water just so. A great ship was years in the building and a fortune in the making, the timber and the iron and the sail and the labor of many hands, and it was treasured accordingly, repaired and maintained and passed down. And in the end, for the very greatest, dragged ashore and buried whole with its dead owner, the supreme treasure of a world that had made it the center of everything. The ship graves that the archaeologists have found, the great vessels preserved 1,000 years in the blue clay of the burial mounds, are the finest things the Viking world has left us, not the weapons, not the silver, but the ships themselves, the beautiful curved hulls that carried a poor people from the cold edge of the world to a quarter of the globe. The long ship was freedom, and it was death, the road out of the poverty of the north, and the thing that drowned you in the cold sea trying to escape it, the supreme achievement of the Viking world and the instrument of everything it became. The raid is the thing the world remembers, and from the deck of the ship as it runs toward a foreign shore in the gray light of dawn, you begin to understand why it was so terrible. It is the season of raiding, the open water, the months between the spring planting and the autumn harvest, when the young men of the north, the ones with no farm to inherit and a hunger for silver and for fame, climb into the ships and go Viking. They are not an army. There is no king commanding them, no campaign, no conquest planned, not at first. They are bands of free men joined to a leader they have chosen to follow, drawn by the promise of plunder and the chance to win the wealth and the reputation that a poor man could never win at home. They have pooled their effort to build or to crew a ship. They will share the plunder among themselves according to their rank and their contribution. They are partners in a violent enterprise, and they have come for what they can take. And they take it from the soft, rich, undefended lands to the south and the west, the lands of the Christian kingdoms, wealthy beyond anything the north can imagine, and in the early years, utterly unprepared. The monasteries above all. For the monastery is the perfect target. Rich, full of the gold and silver and jewels of the church, stocked with food and with people who can be sold as slaves and undefended, for who would attack a house of God? The monks have no walls, no warriors, no warning. And out of the dawn comes the ship, run up onto the beach, and the warriors pouring out of it. And the world the monks have known is over in an hour. The treasures seized, the buildings burned, the monks killed or carried off in chains to be sold in the slave markets of the north. The chroniclers of the Christian lands wrote of these raids in tones of apocalyptic horror. As a punishment from God, a scourge out of the sea, the heathen men who came from nowhere and destroyed everything and vanished back into the water before any force could be raised against them. The terror was real, and it was deliberate, and it was effective. The thing that made the raid so devastating was the ship and the speed it gave. A raiding band could appear without warning, strike, and be gone before the local lord could gather his men. They could sail up a river deep into a country, hit a town far inland that thought itself safe, and be back at sea before anyone could respond. They could not be caught, and they could not be predicted, and against an enemy who could come from anywhere along thousands of miles of coast and river, the slow, land-bound kingdoms of the south had no good answer. For decades the raids grew bolder and larger, from a few ships to fleets, from quick smash and grab to the seizing of whole towns, from summer voyages to armies that stayed the winter. Until at last the raiding turned into something more, into conquest, into the seizing of land, into the great armies that carved out kingdoms in England and Ireland and France, and the settlement that planted Norse colonies from Dublin to Normandy to the Russian rivers. The raid was the seed of all of it, the violent reconnaissance that revealed how rich and how weak the South was, and that drew, year after year, more ships and more men out of the North to take their share. To be on the raiding side of it is to live in a particular kind of intensity, the long, dangerous voyage, the gamble of the open sea. And then the sudden violence of the strike, the running of the ship onto the beach, the rush up from the water, the swift, brutal work of seizing what can be seized before any resistance can form. It is robbery on a heroic scale, and it is also murder and enslavement and the burning of the homes of people who have done you no wrong. And the Viking world did not trouble itself overmuch with the distinction. The plunder was glory. The man who came home with silver and with slaves and with stories was a man whose standing rose, whose reputation grew, who could marry well and buy land and become, in time, a person of consequence. The raid was the great equalizer, the way a poor man could become rich and a nobody could become a name. And the values of the whole society, the prizing of courage and of strength and of the winning of wealth and fame, pointed toward it, celebrated it, made of the successful raider a hero. And to be on the other side of it, to be the monk at his prayers, the farmer in his field, the townsman in his bed, when the heathen men come up from the sea, is to know a terror that the sources have preserved across all the centuries since. The Vikings were not uniquely cruel by the standards of their violent age. The Christian kingdoms made war on each other with a savagery that matched anything the Norse did. But the suddenness of the raids, the impossibility of defending against them, the targeting of the holy places, the carrying off of people into slavery, the sense of a malice coming out of the unknown sea, these gave the Viking raids a particular horror. And they earned the Norse a reputation that has outlasted their gods and their language and their world by 1,000 years. The raid is why we remember them. It is the smallest part of what they were. They were farmers and traders and craftsmen and lawgivers and settlers and explorers, far more than they were raiders. But it is the part that burned itself into the memory of the world, the part the monks wrote down with shaking hands, the ship out of the dawn and the death it carried. For every Viking who went raiding, there were more who went trading, and the silver that flowed into the north came as often from the market as from the sword. This is the other half of the Viking story, the half the legends forget. The same ships that carried the raiders carried the traders. Often they were the same men, raiding where the taking was easy and trading where it was not, and the line between the two was never as clear as a later age would like. For the Viking world was, before and after and even during the age of the raids, a vast and intricate web of trade reaching from the markets of the Arab Caliphate to the shores of North America. And the people of the north grew wealthy as much from buying and selling as from burning and seizing. They had things the world wanted. From the north came furs above all, the pelts of the marten and the fox and the squirrel and the bear, the warm, rich furs of the cold forests, prized in the markets of the south and the east, where the wealthy paid in silver for them. There was amber, the golden stone of the Baltic, worked into beads and ornaments and traded the length of the known world. There was walrus ivory and walrus hide rope, and the down of the eider, and dried fish, the stockfish that could be carried anywhere, and that fed the markets of distant cities. There was iron and soapstone carved into bowls and weights, and the fine woven wool that the women of the north produced in such quantity. And there were slaves. The slave trade was one of the great engines of the Viking economy. Captives taken in raids and bought in markets were carried along the trade routes to be sold in the slave markets of the East. A strong young captive from the cold lands could bring a good price in Arab silver. And in return came the wealth of the wider world. Above all came silver. These were the silver coins of the Arab Caliphate, the dirhams. They were struck in the mints of distant Baghdad and Samarkand, then carried up the great rivers of Russia by Norse traders. They flowed into the north in such quantities that buried hoards across Scandinavia contain hundreds of thousands of them. For the Viking world ran on silver, but not on coins as you would understand them. It ran on silver by weight, on the hack silver economy, in which the value of a thing was the weight of the silver it was worth. And a merchant carried a small folding balance and a set of weights, and payment was made by weighing out silver, cutting up coins and arm rings and ingots into fragments until the weight was right. The arm ring was money you wore. The coin was money you weighed. The lump of hacked silver was the small change of a whole civilization. And the little balances and the cut fragments turn up in the graves and the hoards across the entire Viking world, the quiet evidence of a people as devoted to the weighing of silver as to the swinging of the axe. To make this trade, the Vikings built towns, the first true towns of the north, the great market centers where the goods of the world changed hands. There was Hedeby, on the neck of the Danish peninsula, one of the largest towns of northern Europe, a crowded, crammed place of workshops and wharves and merchants from a dozen lands. There was Birka, on its island in the lake of central Sweden, the great market of the eastern trade. There was Kaupang in Norway, and Dublin in Ireland, founded by the Norse as a slave market and trading port that would grow into a city. And Jorvik, the Viking York, and the trading posts the Norse planted along the Russian rivers, Novgorod and Kiev, that would become the seeds of a nation. These towns were unlike anything else in the Viking world. Not farms, not scattered settlements, but dense crowded places where people lived by craft and commerce, where the smith and the comb maker and the bead maker and the leather worker plied their trades in row upon row of workshops, where ships from across the known world tied up at the wharves and unloaded the goods of distant lands, where silver was weighed, and slaves were sold, and the wealth of half the world flowed through in a great current. And the trade routes themselves were among the great achievements of the age. To the west, the Norse traded across the seas they had mastered, from Iceland and Greenland and the British Isles. But the greatest trading voyages went east. They went down the long rivers of Russia with the Norse traders, the Slavs, called the Rus. They dragged their boats between river systems, ran the rapids of the Dnieper, and fought off the steppe nomads. At last they reached the Black Sea and the walls of Constantinople, the greatest city of the Christian world, which the Norse called Miklagard, the Great City. There they traded, and there some of them stayed, taking service as the Varangian Guard, the elite bodyguard of the emperor himself, Norse axemen guarding the throne of Byzantium, half a world away from the cold fjords of their birth. And beyond Constantinople they went on, down to the Caspian and into the lands of the Arab Caliphate. In those markets the merchants of the north met a civilization more ancient and more wealthy than anything they had imagined. They weighed out their furs and slaves for the silver dirhams that would flow back up the rivers to the north. An Arab traveler who met them on the Volga left a famous account of these Rus traders, their size and their fairness, their tattoos, their weapons, their commerce. And the great ship funeral he witnessed, one of the only eyewitness descriptions of a Viking world that otherwise speaks to us mostly through its silent graves. So the trader is as true a figure of the Viking world as the raider, and more common, and in the long run, more important. The raids terrorized the south and won the Vikings their fearsome name, but the trade enriched the north and connected it, for the first time, to the whole sweep of the known world, from the markets of Baghdad to the shores of a new continent. The same boldness, the same seamanship, the same willingness to gamble everything on a long voyage into the unknown served both the raid and the trade, and the same man might, in a single voyage, do both. The silver in the hoards came from both, some of it seized, some of it earned, all of it weighed out on the little balances and buried in the cold earth of the north, where it waited 1,000 years to tell us that these people were not only the destroyers the monks remembered, but merchants and travelers who had drawn a thread of trade and silver across a quarter of the world. The warrior is not a soldier, and the difference is the key to understanding both the glory and the limits of Viking war. A soldier is part of an army, trained and drilled and disciplined, fighting as a unit under command. The Viking warrior is something older and more individual, a free man who fights for his own honor and his own gain, joined to a leader by personal loyalty rather than by the impersonal machinery of a state, valuing above all the individual deeds of courage by which a man wins fame. Viking warfare is, at its heart, the warfare of the warband. A leader and free men choose to follow one another, bound by oaths, feast, and plunder. They fight in a loose formation. It depends more on individual ferocity and the strength of the shield wall than on the drilled maneuvers of a professional army. The weapons tell you what kind of war this is. The spear is the most common, the weapon of the ordinary free man, cheap and effective, used to thrust and to throw. The axe is the weapon of the Viking imagination, the bearded axe, the great two-handed axe that could split a shield or a helmet, a tool of the farm turned to war, the weapon of the man who could not afford better, and the favored weapon of many who could. And the sword is the weapon of status. It is the prized possession, the costly masterwork of the smith. It is pattern-welded from twisted rods of iron and steel, given a name, passed down through generations, and buried with its owner or handed to his son. The sword marks the man of standing. It marks the warrior who has won enough wealth to own one. A fine sword is among the most valuable things in the whole Viking world. For protection there is the shield, the round wooden shield that every warrior carries, used not just to block, but to fight with, to push and to strike, the shields locking together in the shield wall that is the basic formation of Viking battle. The wealthy wear mail, the shirt of interlinked iron rings that turns a blade, and a helmet of iron, and here we must set aside the great myth. For the Vikings did not wear horns on their helmets. That is a fantasy of a much later age, and the real helmet was a simple practical cap of iron, sometimes with a guard for the nose, made to protect the head and nothing more. The battle itself, when warbands meet, is a brutal close-quarters affair of the shield wall. The two sides form their lines, shields overlapping, spears and axes ready, and they advance and they clash, and the fighting is a heaving, shoving, hacking press of men, each line trying to break the other, to open a gap through which the formation can be rolled up and destroyed. It is exhausting and terrifying and intimate. You can see the face of the man you are trying to kill. You can feel the press of the bodies. The wall holds or it breaks. And when it breaks, the killing becomes a slaughter, the broken side cut down as they flee. There is little of maneuver, little of strategy as a later age would understand it. There is the courage to stand in the wall, the strength to push and to strike, the will to hold when the line wavers. And the discipline, for there is a discipline of a kind, to keep the shields locked and the line solid in the face of the enemy's charge. The man who breaks the wall is a hero. The man who runs from it is shamed forever. And then there are the berserkers, the warriors of legend, the men who fought in a battle fury so extreme that they seemed to feel no pain and no fear, who, the sources say, went into battle without armor, biting their shields, howling, possessed by a rage that made them terrible and nearly unstoppable. The berserker is a figure of awe and of fear in the Viking imagination, a warrior given over wholly to the fury of Odin, the battle madness that is both a gift and a curse. How much of the berserker is real and how much is legend, no one can fully say. Perhaps a real warrior cult, perhaps the effect of some intoxicant, perhaps a learned state of combat trance, perhaps simply the awe of ordinary men before those who fought with the ferocity beyond the normal. But the figure is central to how this world imagined war, and it points to the deepest value of the whole warrior ethos, the prizing of courage above life itself, the willingness to throw oneself into the fury of battle without regard for survival. The making of a warrior began young, for there were no soldiers' schools and no standing army to train men, only the long apprenticeship of a life lived among weapons. The boy of a free family grew up with the axe and the spear, learning to use them as he learned everything else, by doing, in the games and the contests and the hunting that filled a young life, in the wrestling that built the strength and the rough play that taught the nerve. He learned to row and to handle a boat, and to endure the cold and the wet and the hunger, because these were the conditions of the life he would lead. He heard the tales of the heroes by the winter fire, the stories of courage and of glory that taught him what a man should be, that filled him with the longing for fame and the fear of shame that would drive him all his life. And when he was old enough, and that was young by your standards, for a youth might go on his first raid in his teens, he took his place among the men at the oar, in the wall, and learned the last and hardest lessons in the only school that taught them, the fight itself. There was no clear line between the warrior and the farmer, and this too is the key to it. The same man who held the plow held the axe. The free farmer was also, by right and by necessity, a fighting man, armed and ready. For in a world without a state to keep the peace, every free man had to be able to defend himself and his family and his honor. The war band that went raiding was made of farmers, the younger sons and the restless and the ambitious, who would fight in the season of the open water and return, those who returned, to the farm and the plow. The great army that conquered a kingdom was made of such men, gathered from across the north by the promise of land and silver and fame. There was no professional soldiery, no caste set apart for war. There was only the free man, who farmed and who fought, who was peaceful when peace served and deadly when it did not, and whose readiness to take up arms was as much a part of his freedom as his land and his voice at the thing. To be unarmed, to be unable to fight, was to be less than free. The weapon was the mark of the man, and every free Viking bore one. For that is the heart of it, the thing that made the Viking warrior what he was. This is a world that believes the manner of your death matters more than its timing. To die well, in battle, with your weapon in your hand, facing the enemy, Having shown courage is the best death there is, the death that wins fame among the living and a place among the chosen dead. To die badly, of sickness, of old age, in your bed, the straw death, as they scornfully called it, is a lesser fate, a death without glory. And so the warrior throws himself forward, holds the wall, faces the spear, because his courage is the thing his whole world values most, the thing that wins him fame in life and honor in death. And because the gods themselves, sliding toward their own doom, taught that the only thing that finally matters is how you meet your fate. The Viking warrior is terrible not because he is disciplined or well-equipped, often he is neither, but because he is unafraid to die. And in the close, brutal press of the shield wall, the man who does not fear death is the most dangerous thing on the field. When the sickness comes, there is no physician to send for, and the people of this world turn instead to the herbs and to the runes and to the woman who can see the threads of fate. The Viking world has no medicine in any sense you would recognize, no physicians trained in a tradition of learning, no hospitals, no theory of the body beyond the practical and the magical. What it has is the accumulated lore of the household and the community, the knowledge of the herbs and the simple treatments held mostly by the women, passed down by doing the same plants and poultices and broths that every old world used against the same illnesses. There is the staunching of wounds, the setting of broken bones, the herbs for the fever and the pain and the wound that will not heal, and some of it works, the practical wisdom of generations, the willow and the yarrow and the dozens of plants whose uses were known. The Vikings were, by the standards of their age, a healthy and a hardy people, well-fed enough and active enough to be strong, and the archaeology shows them tall and robust. But against the real killers, the infected wound, the fever, the wasting sickness, the deaths of childbirth and of infancy, they had little, and the same terrible toll fell on them as on every old world. The children dying young, the women dying in birth, the strong cut down by an illness that no one understood and no one could stop. And where the herbs failed, there was the other kind of healing, the magical, for in this world the line between medicine and magic does not exist. Sickness could be the work of unseen forces, a curse, the malice of a spirit, the working of another's magic, and so the cure could be magical too. There were the runes, the angular letters that were not just writing but power, carved and reddened and used to heal, to protect, to curse, to win love, to turn a blade. The right runes, carved in the right way by one who knew their power, could cure a sickness or save a life, or, carved wrongly, could kill. There were charms and spells and the invocation of the gods. And above all, there was Seiðr, the deep magic of the Norse world, the magic of fate and prophecy and the spirits, and the figure who wielded it, the Volva, the seeress. The Volva is one of the most striking figures of the Viking world, a woman of power in a world ruled by men, feared and honored and sought out in equal measure. She is the one who can see, who can send her spirit out across the world and into the other worlds, who can speak with the dead and the spirits, who can read the threads of fate and tell what is coming. When a community is troubled by famine, by sickness, by the fear of the future, the Volva is sent for, and she comes and a great ritual is made. She is given a high seat, and the proper preparations are made, and songs are sung to call the spirits. And she falls into the trance of Seiðr, And from that trance she speaks, answering the questions put to her, telling the fates of those who ask, foretelling the season to come, the success of the voyage, the fortune of the child. Her word carries enormous weight. This is a world that believes deeply in fate, in the idea that the threads of every life are spun, measured, and cut by forces beyond human control. The one who can see those threads can see the future itself. Her vision can shape the decisions of farmers, chieftains, and kings. For fate is the deep belief beneath all of it, the thing that gives the Viking world its particular character. The Norns, the three great weavers, sit at the roots of the world tree and spin the threads of fate, and what they weave is fixed, and even the gods are subject to it. Your fate, the length of your life, the manner of your death, is set, woven into the great web, and there is nothing you can do to change it. And this belief, which might have produced despair, produced instead its opposite, a fierce and reckless courage. For if your death is already fixed, already woven, already waiting at its appointed hour, then there is no use in caution, no point in cowardice, no profit in clinging to a life that will end exactly when it is fated to end, and not a moment sooner or later. You cannot avoid your death by fleeing from it. You can only meet it well or badly. And so the wise course is to act boldly, to fight bravely, to seize the day and the deed and the glory. Because the only thing within your power is not whether you die, but how. Whether you meet your fated end with courage or with fear, whether you leave behind a name that lives or a name that is forgotten. The belief in fixed fate is the engine of Viking courage. In this world, even the gods are doomed. That belief sends men into the shield wall and onto the open sea without flinching. It holds that the only immortality available is reputation, the deed remembered, and the name that outlives the body. So when the sickness comes, you do what can be done, the herbs, the broth, the setting of the bone, the carving of the rune, the sending for the vulva, to read what the Norns have woven, and then you wait to see what fate has decided, and you try, whatever comes, to meet it as your world taught you to meet everything, without flinching, with your courage intact, ready to be remembered well. The dark comes early and stays late, and in the long northern night, the Viking world draws in around its fires and tells the stories that hold the meaning of everything. The winter here is not the winter of the south. It is a darkness that swallows the year. The days shrink until, in the far north, the sun barely rises at all. Noon becomes a brief gray twilight, and then the dark returns. The nights stretch to 16 hours, 18 hours, and more. The world is reduced to the small circle of the fire in the Longhouse and the howling of the wind beyond the turf walls. The cold is absolute. The work of the warm seasons is done. The animals are in the byre, fed on the stored hay. The stores are counted and rationed. The ships are drawn up, and the sea roads closed by the storms. And the people gather in the Longhouse, in the long dark, and they wait for the light to come back. And they fill the waiting with the things that the long night is for. The work that can be done indoors, the spinning and the weaving and the carving and the mending, the drinking of the ale and the mead, and above all, the telling of the tales. For this is a world without books, in which the whole of its memory and its meaning and its wisdom lives in words spoken aloud, and the long winter night is when those words are spoken. The poet, the skald, is among the most honored figures of this world, the keeper of the verse, the maker of the praise poems that celebrate the deeds of the great and the elegies that preserve the memory of the dead. Poetry is a high and difficult art here. It is dense and intricate, full of kennings, the riddling phrases of the north. A ship becomes the horse of the sea. Gold becomes the fire of the river. Battle becomes the storm of swords. Poetry is so prized that the gift of it was said to come from Odin himself, from the mead of poetry that he stole and gave to the worthy. Around the high poetry of the skalds lies the vast world of the tales. There are stories of the gods and their doings, myths of creation and the coming doom, legends of ancient heroes, and sagas of the more recent past. These are accounts of great families, feuds, voyages, and ancestors. They preserve the memory of who did what and why. They are held in the words of those who tell them and passed down through the generations in the long winter nights. These stories are not entertainment, or not only. They are the carriers of everything this world knows and believes, its history, its law, its genealogy, its religion, its values, its sense of who its people are and how they should live. In the telling of the tales, the child learns what courage is, and what honor is, and what the gods require, and who his ancestors were, and what it means to be one of his people. The whole education of the Viking in a world with no schools happens here, by the fire, in the words of the old telling the young the stories that contain the wisdom of the people. And the deepest of those stories is the one about death. For the Viking does not fear death as the lands to the south fear it, and the long night is when the meaning of death is told and retold. There is Valhalla, the hall of the slain, where Odin gathers the bravest of those who die in battle, chosen by the Valkyries on the field, and carried to the great hall where they feast and fight and prepare, day after day. For the final battle of Ragnarok, the warrior's paradise, the reward of courage, the reason to die well with a weapon in your hand. There are the other halls of the dead, Freya's field, where some of the slain go, the realm of hell, the cold underworld where those who die the straw death of sickness and old age go down into the dark. There is the belief in the dead who linger, in the barrow, in the mound, the dead who can return, who must be honored, who are not wholly gone. The Norse picture of the afterlife is not a single clear doctrine, but a rich and shifting and sometimes contradictory web of beliefs. But through all of it runs the same thread, that death is not an ending to be feared, but a passage to be met, that the manner of your dying shapes what comes after, and that the only thing that truly survives is the memory of how you lived and how you died, the name and the reputation that the stories carry forward into the world of the living. And so the dead are sent on their way with ceremony. The great are buried in their ships, or in great mounds, with their weapons and their treasures and their horses, and sometimes their sacrificed servants, equipped for whatever comes next, honored with a funeral whose scale proclaims their standing. The dead are burned sometimes, the smoke carrying them upward, or buried to lie in the mound. And the rituals are made, and the ale is drunk in their memory, and the poet speaks the elegy that fixes their deeds in the memory of the living. For the funeral is, in the end, the last and greatest assertion of the thing this whole world believes, that a life is measured by its deeds and its courage, that death is to be met without flinching, and that the dead live on in the stories told of them by the living in the long winter nights, by the fire, in the words that hold the memory of a people against the dark. You lie back now on the set bench of the Longhouse, in the warmth of the banked fire and the breathing of the sleepers and the animals, with the wind working at the turf roof and the sea, far off, breathing against the cold rocks of the fjord. The day is done, the work is done, the stories have been told, and the fire is low, and the long night holds the settlement in its dark hand. And somewhere out beyond the mouth of the fjord, the great sea stretches away toward all the places the ships have gone, and all the places they have not gone yet. This is the Viking world. This is the real Viking world, not the horned helmet and not the savage of legend. It is the cold Longhouse and the shared fire. It is the dried fish and the soured milk. It is the endless labor of the farm, the keys at the woman's belt, the honor that must be defended, and the feud that will not end. It is the law spoken aloud at the thing, the doomed gods and the bargain of the blot, the beautiful deadly ship and the terror it carried. It is courage in the face of a fate already woven, and stories told by the fire against the long dark of the northern night. You would not have lasted a day here. You do not know the language or the gods or the thousand things that everyone here learned before they could walk. But for one night you have lain in the Longhouse and heard the sea, and that is enough. The fire is almost out now. The sleepers are still, the wind is dropping, and beyond the walls the sky over the fjord is beginning, very faintly, to think about the dawn. Let it come. You do not have to meet it. You can let this hard, cold, beautiful world fade now, back into the dark of 1,000 years ago, and let yourself drift down, the way the Longhouse drifts down into sleep, with the warmth of the fire and the breathing of the sea. Close your eyes. The Viking Age is letting you go.